In the latest chapter of One Piece, Sanji has had his first clash with one of the God's Knights, obliterating Killingham with the Ifrit Jambe kick. With Sommer's down and out, many fans seem to be writing in Killingham as Sanji's matchup for this arc. For Sanji fans, it doesn't really seem to matter who Sanji fights as long as it's one-on-one against a God's Knight, as it would require him to develop advanced Conquerors Haki, which is their one and only known weakness. With the introduction of Scopper Gaban in this arc as the left hand of the Pirate King, it seemed to solidify the fact that Sanji will not be far behind Luffy and Zoro when it's all said and done. And the fact that the God's Knights and Gorosei seem to be the final opponents of the series, and that Scopper Gaban has been confirmed to have Conquerors Haki, it seems to be the basic requirement for Sanji to have if he's going to fight side by side with his fellow monsters in the final war. We even get a bit of a teaser in this arc where Sanji asks Scopper about his own Conquerors Haki potential, and we don't get to hear his answer, but we do get to see Sanji's shocked reaction. So this means that Oda is fully aware of the Conquerors Haki question when it comes to Sanji, and has laid a Chekov's gun for it to be answered at least by the end of this Elbaf arc. Plot-wise, it appears necessary for Sanji to get Conquerors Haki, but if you look at things narratively, Conquerors Haki would make the least sense for Sanji's character. If you go through the series and look at the requirements for Conquerors Haki and what it means narratively, and compare that to Sanji's character and what he represents, you'll see that it doesn't really fit at all. And Sanji's power set might actually represent something different, but just as important as Conquerors Haki, which can make him so much more interesting and unique. So that's what I'll be explaining in this video, and by the end, hopefully I'll convince you that Sanji won't be a conqueror, and why that's a good thing, and who I think the next conqueror of the crew might be instead. The Egghead arc made clear what One Piece's most iconic power system represents. Devil Fruits represents dreams, which is a foundational theme in One Piece. However, Haki is more important because it thematically represents the willpower that you need to make that dream into reality. Out of the three forms of Haki, Conquerors Haki is the pinnacle of Haki and the only one that cannot be learned by anyone. That's because it requires a certain trait, and that trait likewise represents the pinnacle of willpower, the disposition of a king. Now, trying to pin down the requirements to be a Conquerors Haki user is tricky, because for every explanation we get, there seems to be an exception. When Zoro unlocks it, we're told that it's because he has kingly ambitions. But on the other hand, you have conquerors like Whitebeard and Ace, whose characters are all about them not having kingly ambitions, and rejecting the king label that has been thrust onto them. We're told that someone is usually born with it, but some characters awaken it while they're young, and others do much later in life. So perhaps by disposition of a king, Oda means that you have to have the biological capacity to have this personality, but you also need the life experience in order to unlock it. When it comes to Sanji, it seems like his entire story is the opposite of this. Sanji comes from royalty, the Germa Kingdom, and his family is notorious for conquering the West Blue in the past, so perhaps he does have the genetic capacity to become a conqueror. But Sanji's story is all about him rejecting this heritage. Judge tries to engineer his sons with science to become hardened warriors, but Sanji's story is about him not embracing this lineage and rebelling against it, choosing his own path forward. Perhaps you can argue that Sanji's story as a conqueror will be about him standing up and rejecting this path that Judge set for him, but Judge would love to find out that Sanji has Conquerors Haki and had potential to be king or emperor. Sanji's rejection of Judge is all about rejecting this warrior's mindset that Conquerors Haki is about, and choosing to be a lowly cook to serve others instead of leading and subjugating. Thematically, Sanji is a lover and not a fighter. Well, everyone in One Piece is technically a fighter, but he doesn't love to fight. He fights for love and with love. That's what Sanji is all about. Another way we can determine what it takes to be a conqueror is by comparing and contrasting Conquerors Haki users from non-users. The best examples we can use is the main trios that Oda has written in the story. Of course, you have the Monster Trio, which includes Sanji along with Luffy and Zoro, but you also have the Supernova Trio of Luffy, Kid, and Law, and finally the Brothers Trio of Ace, Sabo, and Luffy. Now, out of all of these trios, 2 out of the 3 of them are confirmed to be Conquerors Haki user, and there's always one odd man out, which I think is a very intentional design. If you look at the personalities of each trio, the 2 conquerors are very hot-headed and impulsive, while the non-conqueror is very careful and thoughtful. Now, not every conqueror has to be so bold and irrational like Luffy, Kid, and Zoro, but I think the underlying idea is that conquerors need to have this never back down mindset, and Oda writes them this way so that they can contrast more easily with those who rely on their brains more than their willpower, like Sanji, Law, and Sabo do. But the introduction of Scopper Gaban seems to throw a wrench in this theory, as the Pirate King trio seems to be the most direct parallel to the Monster Trio, and all 3 of them have Conquerors Haki. However, I don't think Scopper is Sanji's direct parallel when it comes to personality and mindset, as he actually seems to be the wild and brash one out of the trio in his youth. Scopper was known to butt heads constantly with Roger back in the day, and the calm and calculated one appeared to be the right hand Rayleigh instead. But you also have to keep in mind that just like the red-haired pirates, almost none of the Roger pirates use devil fruits and they rely on Haki instead. Because they aren't the main characters, naturally the Roger pirates aren't going to have as interesting abilities compared to the Straw Hats, but narratively they still need to be strong enough to serve as the model for the Straw Hats. So I think that's one of the two reasons why Oda chose to have them rely on Haki so much and gave the top 3 fighters all advanced Conquerors Haki. But when it comes to Sanji and the other Straw Hats besides Luffy and Zoro, Oda seems to be avoiding using Haki as a power-up for them and focusing on their unique abilities instead. Usopp is the sole exception to this, but this plays into my point further as I'll explain later. Oda gave Luffy and Zoro 3 Haki power-ups between the two of them in the Wano arc alone, yet Sanji still has the same basic armament and observation that he started with at the start of the time skip. Oda easily could have given him Future Sight and Whole Cake or advanced armament in Wano, yet Oda chooses to give Sanji Germa upgrades and develop his flames instead in the Wano arc. And I think this goes again to Oda writing Luffy and Zoro in a distinct way from the rest of the Straw Hats, which I explained in another video. But to me this affirms that Oda is following the A-Sabo Luffy or the Luffy Kid-in-Law dynamic when it comes to Conquerors Haki for the Monster Trio as well. So why does Oda choose to develop Sanji's flames instead of his Haki? Well, that's because of what it represents. Haki represents the will to achieve a dream, but I think Sanji's flames represents dreams itself in a way. The source of Sanji's flames are still a mystery in the story. Some people theorize that he's part Lunarian, or at least that Judge changed his lineage factor in a way, and that there's a scientific explanation for them. But others take Sanji's word at face value and claim that he's creating the flames literally from the passion of his heart. Personally, I think it might be a combination of both, but either way it's following the same principles of devil fruits, which is that they're made from dreams, and they give people powers by fundamentally changing their lineage factor. This also fits thematically, as something that many people forget is that Sanji is the big dreamer of the crew, right next to Luffy. Sanji's dream of finding the All Blue is very similar to Luffy's dream of finding the One Piece. It's idealistic and childish, and it may not even exist, but One Piece is a world where anything humans can imagine can exist in reality. The difference is that there doesn't seem to be a concrete path forward for Sanji's dream as it is for Luffy's, as Luffy knows that he has to trounce the admirals and the Yonko to become the Pirate King to achieve his dream. Zoro's dream is kind of the opposite of Sanji's, as it has a very clear path forward and it requires him to accumulate power, but in the context of One Piece, it isn't as much of a dream as it is a goal. Zoro's dream really doesn't require much imagination, as he knows who Mihawk is and defeating him is very tangible and possible. It requires ambition, sure, but it doesn't require romanticism, which is an essential theme of One Piece. Both Zoro and Sanji's journey seem to be like if you took Luffy's journey and split it, giving the linear progression and clear goal to Zoro, and the romantic and dreamy idealism to Sanji. They represent the two aspects of One Piece, action and adventure, which is a product of having ambition and dreams, which is then manifested through the power system of Haki and Devil Fruit. When it comes to the Roger Pirates, they were abundant in Conquerors Haki and Haki users overall, but not Devil Fruits, and I think thematically this is because they had all the means to bring the dawn of the world as the Pirate King's crew, but they didn't have that end. They were able to reach the final island and had the strength to overturn the world, but they were too early. Roger was not the one who would bring the dawn, as he wasn't carrying the dream, which is why he didn't have the Devil Fruit. Luffy on the other hand has a Devil Fruit, the Nika Fruit, because he carries the will of Joy Boy to fulfill that promise and to bring the dawn. And I think Sanji represents this half of the equation that the Roger Pirates lacked. Sanji technically doesn't have a Devil Fruit, but like I said earlier, his abilities seem to resemble one, minus the weaknesses. In fact, I think Sanji's flames may even represent something that precedes the Devil Fruits. Throughout all of Egghead, and even within the recent chapter, Vegapunk has been reiterating the importance of energy. Vegapunk can seemingly create anything, but his one limitation, which becomes a limitation for the entire world as a result, is energy. And for Vegapunk, his ideal energy source is fire, which is why he created the Mother Flame, which appears to be a mere imitation of the ancient energy source that powered the ancient kingdom. This seems to be the sun that appears in the mural and in the Harley as well, which may function the same as the Mother Flame, except that it's an infinite source. This may also be the same flames that are on the back of the Lunarians, as they were known to rule the world even before the Celestial Dragons. So if Sanji really does have Lunarian DNA, or at least if his powers function similarly, that can make his flames extremely relevant in the final war. I'm also a firm believer that Luffy will need one more situational power up to counter his Gear 5 stamina weakness. Some theorize that he'll need Sanji's cooking in order to give him energies, and others say that he'll eat the Mother Flame itself. But either way, if energy is a really important thing in this final war, and flames is the energy source that One Piece relies on, then I think Sanji's fire abilities will be extremely important, if not plot-wise, at least thematically. So if Sanji really won't get Conquerors Haki and will develop his flames instead, then how will he be able to defeat the Gorosei and the God's Knights? Well, there are two possibilities that I see. Option 1 is that Sanji's flames will have a unique property that will allow him to counter the immortality of Imu's minions. We've seen that with the other abilities of One Piece, which seem to give its users invincibility at first, like the Logia abilities pre-time skip or Kaido's durability. There's always two ways that they can be countered. One option is always Haki, because Haki is able to conquer all thematically, but there's also the option of finding the unique and distinct counter to that ability. For example, Logias can be defeated through Ornament Haki, but also by using an element that perfectly conquers the element the Logia is made of, like water with Crocodile and rubber with Enno. Likewise, Kaido's durability can be neutralized through advanced Haki, but there are other techniques that got around Kaido's durability that were used by characters like Law and Killer. The latter example is especially relevant because those two characters are very similar to Sanji personality-wise relative to their captains and contemporaries, and can be used as a template for how Oda will apply this difference within the context of a fight. The second route that Oda can go is by making it so Sanji actually can't hurt Imu's subordinates, at least not on his own. In this case, Sanji will either be forced to fight a different opponent or will require the assistance of another Conquerors Haki user in order to defeat his opponent. I think this will be incredibly embarrassing for Sanji fans, but I personally think it could work narratively if he's paired with the right partner. But Sanji fans also have to keep in mind that inherently, Sanji's character will be more embarrassing on the surface level, because he's not meant to be a warrior or brawler like Luffy and Zoro are. It's not a coincidence that Oda seems to humiliate Sanji every arc, before he finally shines the end in a way unique to him. There's always a third option though, which is that I'm completely wrong and Sanji does in fact develop Conquerors Haki as well. If I were a betting man, I wouldn't write out the fact that Sanji gets Conquerors Haki. Not because I think it's the best or more interesting way for the story to go, but I think it's the most simple and easy path to appease fans and make him relevant in the final war, even if it goes against his character. Conquerors Haki in general doesn't seem to hold the same weight as it once had. I don't mean in terms of usefulness, because it has become supremely important, but I mean narratively, because now it's so important, it's almost essential to be a top tier and to be relevant against this world government in the final fight. It's so incredibly common to the point that it's lost all of its thematic meaning and is basically in the final war what basic Ornament Haki was at the start of the New World. Depending on how this video does and how people respond, I may make a separate video on this Conquerors Haki bargain bin sale that's been going on and how this hurts the series. But my next video is going to be a part 2 to this video, explaining why I think Usopp will not only fight and defeat Killingham, but he will be the next crew member to unlock Conquerors Haki instead of Sanji. So be sure to subscribe if you want to see that video as soon as it comes out. And with that, I'll see you in the next video.